Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tragic Optimism, responding to the doom and gloom of the beer industry. While that's a lot of words to take in, today's conversation with Chris Douglas, performance coach and co founder of The Growth Equation, will focus on turning challenges into opportunities and sustaining success in our ever evolving industry. Chris and I met via, of course, the internet. I had a habit of emailing authors after finishing a book I enjoy. I had recently read Peak Performance and reached out to the authors Brad and Steve. I soon received an email back from Chris, who works with the authors to develop and oversee business operations and growth strategy. We hopped on a call, we clicked, and I'm excited for a deeper conversation today. But first, Chris, let's let everybody have the opportunity to get to know you. Besides having great hair, tell us a little more about yourself.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much all that there is just the great hair
It's
that's
a
going
superpower,
on here.
right?
Yeah, so my name's Chris. I've been a performance coach for a little bit over 2 years now, under the sort of tutelage of Brad Stulberg, who's an author, whose work Andrew reached out about. Him and Steve Magnus that also co-founded the Growth Equation, which is essentially a signal amongst the noise where you can get really good information about how to perform better at the things that matter most to you. Come full stop. Non-dogmatic, clickbaity. There's no gimmicks. Unfortunately, a lot of the things that we write and talk about are simple but hard, and or simple, not easy. And yeah, in that vein, I've been working with the Growth Equation for over 5 years, and certainly have been on my own journey to perform at the best level that I can. Before working with the Growth Equation, I was an attorney for a long time, and I'm recovering an attorney. I'm recovering attorney now, but yeah, really happy to be here. And thanks for the opportunity, Andrew.
So, two follow ups for you, Chris. What type of law did you practice, and what exactly does performance coach do?
Yeah, so I was a constitutional lawyer, so I did a lot of civil rights litigation, basically fighting the man. Suing the government was pretty much what I did exclusively for a long time there. And then ultimately, I was teaching at Berkeley Law School before I left there to start my own consulting practice and just try something different. And then a performance coach. So, performance coaching or coaching in general you can wear a lot of hats. So you can call it life coach, you can call it executive coach. I like the term performance coach because for me, when I work with clients and individual clients, which could be executives, it could be teachers, could be athletes and the like, I like keying in on being really tactical and being really applied. So yes, we want to be self-aware. Yes, we want to be mindful, but it's more about kind of what are we doing with that and how can we deploy that in such a way that helps us again perform best at the things that matter most to us and sort of tackling really the thorny stuff that sort of are impediments to performance.
No, for you personally, what are you currently working on to perform better at?
Oh, well, I'm always working on things in terms of self-discipline and what I can do to kind of level up my own game. We'll probably talk about it later, but there's really three areas where I think most of us uh, are trying to perform well. One would be sort of at work or in our profession with ourselves, and then with our families and sort of loved ones. So in each area, I'm always trying to level up, one way or another. And it can be trivial, but it's also just a matter of just trying to show up every day the way you want to show up. Which again, this is probably something we'll talk about later. But one thing I've been doing this year, almost as an experiment, is probably going to laugh, but I've decided to make the kitchen sink my exclusive domain. So basically, I set a rule for myself that if I walk by the kitchen and there is a dish in the sink, it's being processed, putting dishwasher, washing it, whatever, and just dealing with all the potential feelings of resentment because someone just put it in there or whatever it is, and just realizing that it's like, hey, I'm doing something that's helpful for my family. Absolutely nothing wrong with having a sparkling clean kitchen, and yeah, doing that is sort of like a daily way of expressing some discipline. It's something that's discreet, but that's also really rewarding for the reasons I mentioned. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having a spotless kitchen.
Not to go too deep down the kitchen sink rabbit hole, but how did you decide upon that in the beginning? Because me, I actually like washing dishes. It's one of the tasks that in the kitchen I'll take. My wife will do something else. But how did you get to this?
Yeah, well, it's all about. It really comes down to sort of being mindful and self-aware. And I noticed that it was something that was frustrating me. I mean, I'm married. I have two small kids. It's organized chaos all the time in my house, and it was something that when I was single, kind of a neat freak, always super organized, and that kind of went away. And yeah, I noticed some resentment building up on like, oh man, the dishes aren't done again, or like, oh, the kitchen's a mess. And I just, instead of feeling resentment, I was like, well, what can I actually do that would be in benefit of my family? And, and in many ways, we'll talk about this later, but when you talk about core values, it's pretty much like, well, what do you claim is important to you? And if I claim one of my core values is being the best family man I can be and the best husband of my wife, and lightening her burden, making her experience of her life together as pleasant as possible, and she doesn't have a natural inclination to be as neat as I am, um, why am I getting mad at her for doing something that isn't in her nature? Wouldn't it be a better use of my mindfulness to then direct that into something that would be helpful for her? And interestingly, one of the byproducts of this, keep going down this rabbit hole of this experiment is like my feelings of resentment have decreased almost completely. And my wife is actually getting better at doing dishes because she sees all the work I'm putting in, so she's contributing more. So she's actually changed her behavior without me asking or without me, humming and hawing about it. All by me just trying to be really direct and tactical about how I choose to be disciplined one way or another.
It's a win for everybody.
Yeah, good
So
stuff.
the beer industry is in a really interesting spot right now. I mean, I feel like we're sometimes closer to 2020 than we are actually 2026. I mean, we dealt with all the pandemic a few years ago. These days, we're dealing with burnout's a huge thing in the beer industry. Trying to find ways to appeal to younger consumers. We're dealing with tariffs. There's so many challenges that brewery owners are facing. At one point, we thought of it as a brewery, but in reality, you're running a business, and there's so many little aspects you have to focus on that it really does take its toll on the owners and the staff and everyone involved in trying to create that business to be as successful as possible. So today, I kind of love to hear your perspective of what we can do from all the things and insights that you have that can apply to the beer industry. And first, I think we should start with just the definition. This session, tragic optimism, that's the first two words people see when they join us today. What is tragic optimism, Chris, and where did the concept come from?
Sure. Yeah, I love this concept. So, tragic optimism was first described by Viktor Frankl, who was a psychologist who wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning, which should be on everyone's reading list if they haven't read it, which recounts his internment in a concentration camp during World War II. And, during his basically being on hell on earth, he was able to hold on to hope, which it sounds like, well, how can someone do that? And, he had this insight that basically that is something that really defines tragic optimism is he said that everything can be taken from a person but one thing, and that's the last of human freedoms, and that's to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance. Essentially, you get to choose how you respond to anything that's coming at you. So tragic optimism really teaches us to sort of experience pain and joy, the change that can bring about anguish and hope, impermanence, representing both beginnings and endings, and not just being tragic, toxically positive or Pollyannish on the one hand and sort of nihilistic and full of despair on the other, but there's a wide chasm in the middle for us to inhabit. And, similar to, this goes all the way back to Buddhism, the first of the Four Noble Truths, which is, life is suffering. And that doesn't mean that like life sucks. It just means like, hey, if you're expecting everything to be hunky dory your entire life, that's not what it is. So as soon as you can come to grips with the fact that life is messy, there are going to be ups and downs, and it's on us to be optimistic despite that. That's really the big unlock to be able to navigate the world we currently live in.
When did this concept become an integral part of your philosophy?
Honestly, ever since I read the book Man's Search for Meaning, which I read it in college and then read it again. Now it's the type of book that I read every year, at least once a year. I recommend it to pretty much all of my coaching clients at some point because it really just like it just can kind of calibrate it for you. Like if this person can, you know, in the worst possible situation that anyone can imagine, still find hope and still hold on to belief. I mean, there's nothing that we can't do, essentially.
I need to go back and read it. It's on my shelf there somewhere, but it is a few years. So thanks for the reminder to dive back in.
Sure, sure.
We're going to come back to tragic optimism, the case for it later in the conversation. But today we're going to dive through four main concepts. And as we chat about, how to respond to these daily challenges we face, let's start with Chris with the importance of knowing your core values. Talk to us a little bit about why that's one of your four big areas you like to dive into.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, as we talk about this, I think it's important to kind of level set, like, what are we doing here? Right. When we're responding to doom and gloom, so much of this is like, well, are we taking care of our own house? What are our systems for evaluating how we feel like we're doing? Core values are a really great way to kind of get to the bottom of that. You can think of core values almost like as an internal dashboard for you to deal with life's challenges. Like, yep, you can have external dashboards, right? Like you can wear an Apple Watch that tells you your how many steps you've walked. You can wear a Whoop that tells you your recovery score, all that stuff. Some of that information is helpful, but we also have an internal dashboard that the more sensitive and the more aware we are of it, how are we feeling? What is our gut telling us? Do we feel like we're doing right and wrong? Like all these thoughts are happening, and the more organized we can be about our internal dashboard, the better we can make decisions. The better we can know what the right decision to be when you might be at a crossroads, you don't know what to do. It's really about getting to this binary choice: is this right or wrong? At its essence, and core values are individual for every person. And essentially, what they define are kind of like, what are the hills you're willing to die on? It helps you figure out, which we'll talk about later, what are your rugged boundaries? And then it allows you to treat everything else flexibly. So for example, if you have to deal with a really difficult decision and you're sort of ruminating about it, running it through your core values, and I'm happy to share mine. So my core values are kindness, consistency, character, and presence. And we can go into that more, Andrew, if you want. But I just run it through that filter. How does this affect my family? Does this mean, am I going to be able to be present the way I want to be? Am I being consistent or inconsistent one way or another? Am I displaying my best version of my character? Am I really standing up? Am I really being virtuous in the decisions that I'm making? By running it through that filter and being sort of self-aware about these things, can be really helpful to deal with, sort of the messiness that's happening. And I would say as well, being self-aware about your values is great, and it's a great start, but it's really not enough. What's really important is taking those core values and then being really intentional about living in furtherance of those things. So like, what are we doing every day to embody these values? What are we doing every day to like show the people that we claim to care about that we care about them, rather than just, with platitudes and stuff like that? So for example, for my core value of kindness, which I try to be a kind person. I try to lead with love, with generosity, give people the benefit of the doubt, show respect. One of the ways that I put that into practice every day, and this is going to sound silly, Andrew, is I try to do a good deed. Like every single day, I try to
Love
give
it.
deed. And sometimes it's like holding a door open for an old lady, or, whatever. And I can always compliment my wife on something at the end of the day if I've just been in the office all day. So there's never an opportunity where you can't do a good deed. And again, it sounds silly. And, my 8-year-old daughter calls it my Sesame Street value, which I'm totally fine with, actually.
I like it. I'm reading the book.
I think it's great. I think it's great. but that's a way of me being like, I did it again. I was able to display this thing that I claim is important to me. Same thing with presence. So, I have a really demanding job. I'm coaching people all day. It takes a lot out of me. When I transition from my office, which is a door in my house, to my home life, which is the living room right outside my door, and my kids are home from school, what am I doing to be really present? So one of the things that I do is like, I leave my phone in my office. I go meet my kids, and I literally get down on the floor on their level. So I get down on my knees. I hang out with my kids. I see them eye to eye, and just that's a signal for me to be like, okay, I'm here now for whatever it is. Want to play Legos? Want to have some junk time? You want to read a book? Whatever it is, and I'm just like super present. And these are the types of things that help sort of prime me for for living in furtherance of my core values, which again, it's great to be self-aware about these things, but it's more important to be like, well, how are we actually performing? Are we living in furtherance of these things? And core values are the types of things where they can be somewhat aspirational. I mean, you shouldn't be delusional about them. Like if you are completely sedentary and you're like, well, my core value is physical fitness, it's like, like, what are we talking about? It's like, let's work our way there. But having aspirational core values, like if you feel like you want to be a better person, you want to have better character, those core values can be really helpful because it can help you calibrate, okay, well, how do I want to perform? Okay, like, what does it look like to be the best version of myself in this setting? And that's where intentionality can be really important. The last thing I'll say is, typically the areas that matter for most people fall into three categories. We're talking about their work, their professional life, their self, sort of their internal life, and then their family or their social life. This is what poet David Whyte calls the three marriages. And I think thinking about, okay, well, how do my core values fit into those three areas can be really helpful for people to, again, kind of figure out, okay, what is important? What do I want to focus on? And as we'll talk about later, these things can be your sources of strength. amidst all the storms and chaos and change that could be happening all around you, and they can really be your sources of strength. So and essentially it can be your source of happiness. So another thing that Viktor Frankl talks about is, when you feel like you're living your authentic self, it becomes easier to find meaning. And once you feel like you have meaning, again, and it doesn't have to just be from one source, right? Sure, you can find your meaning from making great beer, or you can find your meaning from being a great dad or a great husband, son, daughter, whatever. When you feel like you have that, what naturally ensues, the natural byproduct of that, is happiness. And isn't that what we all want to get to, right? Like, that's the whole point of all this, is to get to a place where we're so comfortable in our own skin that the natural byproduct of all this is contentment and happiness.
So when it comes to these core values, and yours were kindness, presence, and what was I'm missing the third?
Consistency and character.
Consistency and character. Is there an ideal number that you find manageable to have? Is it somewhere in the 3 to 5 range, or what do you recommend for someone
It's a great question.
figuring out those values?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if anyone wants to go through one of these exercises, there's plenty of YouTube videos and content on the internet to kind of come up with these. Yeah, I think 3 to 5 really well-defined ones where you can have a concrete daily practice. And again, it doesn't have to be like, oh man, no, I got to do all the, I got 4 core values, 3 areas. So I got to have like all these, it's not like that. It's really like, okay, are you keying in on these things? Are you setting your intention every day? And a good way of thinking about this is like in the morning when you get up and you figure out your morning routines or whatever they are, that's a good time to essentially meditate on how you want the day to go. How do you want to show up? If you have an important meeting with a stakeholder of some kind, like sort of premeditating how you want that to go, what success looks like, being really intentional about how you go into that can help you get to the end goal. Similarly, at the end of the day, you can reflect on how did the day go, give yourself an honest score. Where did you fall short? Oh man, like I was so tired. I was kind of like not super present with my kids. It sucks. It's okay. We're human. We're not going to hit it. We're not going to bat 1,000 all the time. In fact, batting 1,000 isn't the goal. If you think that like, be performing really well means being a 10 out of 10 and all these things that are important, that's impossible. Like 10 out of 10 is perfection. But let me tell you something else. If you can find a way to calibrate this messy system and be a 6 or 7 out of 10 consistently, day in, day out, for months at a time, that's excellence, right? That is something that's sustainable. That's something where you know what your floor is and you're meeting it no matter what. And then, if you want to take a big swing or you want to lean into something one way or another, like, that you're going to have to shift some of these priorities around. But to think that you need to just be batting 1,000 all the time, it's impossible. I mean, even Olympians, if they can do it, we're talking for 10 seconds maybe, and then they come back down to earth like the rest of us. And certainly we've all had, times in our lives when we've wanted to go all in and really just go for it. And that's great. And going all in is amazing, but you have to remember that comes at a cost. And what are we doing to kind of balance that? And we'll talk about it later. And that's where, you don't want to fuse your identity with one thing or another. Like anyone watching or listening to this, like, you're not just a brewer or a business owner, you're a person, you're a son or daughter, you're a husband or wife, you're, a community member, you're a churchgoer, you're an athlete. There's all these different ways to make sure that you keep sort of your identity diversified, so that if one bad thing happens in one area, that doesn't sink the whole ship.
And these concepts we're talking about today, they kind of blur into each other. So it's hard not to jump into the next while we're on one right now. So you've got your personal core values. And let's say there's brewery owners out there listening, or a tap room manager. How do they kind of think about what the core values are for their business, for their tap room? Do we look at it through the same lens?
Yeah, you can certainly look at it through the same lens. I think, if it's a business, a customer service business, then obviously some of the core values kind of take care of themselves. And so obviously you want to have super high customer service. You want your quality to be really high. You want your product to basically, be something that people appreciate, that shows the craftsmanship and, the art of it. So a lot of those core values, and there's a lot of businesses out there, and, certainly the Growth Equation, myself, I've done this work with companies to help them sort of craft their core values. A lot of it is just lip service, right? A lot of it is just like, oh, this is what people want to hear. It's more important to be like, okay, that's not where we are with this. For us, it's really important about being applied. And, core values for a brewery, for example, can be really important because it can also help you figure out what's important. Where, if one of your core values is commitment to quality, don't skimp out on the ingredients, right? Don't skimp out on the process. Don't short circuit, or don't shortchange yourself on your marketing materials and stuff like that. And it's the type of thing that can really help align. Again, ultimately, when you peel the onion, all this stuff, it's really like, is this the right thing or the wrong thing? And core values in particular are helpful when that answer isn't totally intuitive.
I actually saw a post just this morning on LinkedIn. Dr. J with the Brewers Association posted, don't quote me, Dr. J, on this, but I think 70% of people, when they're deciding where to go, look at how that business's values align with theirs and choose to spend money with where they want to go. So, I mean, it's really important, especially in a
Yeah.
challenged market, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, absolutely, and you see it from the top down. I think, I live in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, and a lot of tech companies, a lot of sort of founder CEOs, a lot of people who are like pretty ridiculous, and there's been a lot of examples here of the power of the executive trickling down negatively to staff. So you think about back, I don't know, I guess now almost 10 years ago, it was the Uber and Lyft wars, and Uber would get all the bad press. Lyft would get the benefit of every doubt. They're basically exactly the same company, except one had like the pink mustaches on their cars back in the day. I don't know if folks remember that. It's ridiculous. But the reason Uber would get all the bad press is because their founder, forgetting the guy's last name, Travis something or other, he was an asshole. He was a large type asshole, and it permeated through the leadership and everything else. And, to the point where when he was replaced as CEO, the first thing that the person who replaced him did was try to change the culture and engage in more philanthropy and be better to employees and be better to their drivers. As a signal, it's like, hey, we're changing this because that wasn't working. So on a much, and obviously these are billion-dollar companies. On a much smaller scale, if it's passion project or a family business, or you put all your life savings into this thing, it almost makes it doubly important from the top down to be very values driven, very customer service oriented, and just lead with purpose.
No, yeah, 100% there. So in our quest to just run more successful businesses and just be better people, you really love the concept of embracing rugged flexibility. And I love that, but can you define it for us?
Sure, sure. And this is a concept from Brad Stulber's book, The Practice of Groundedness, which is another book I recommend a lot, not just because he's my mentor, but I just
Thank
think
you again.
yeah, yeah, yeah. In fact, Andrew, when we were chatting and I found out you hadn't read it, I just like mailed you a copy real quick so you could check it out. So rugged flexibility is really sort of like a gritty endurance, like an anti-fragility that can withstand change, and but thrives in its midst, right? So this is the quality we need, to skillfully work with change, so that we can understand what's important, and then the stuff that isn't as important, we can deal very flexibly. So in the core values perspective, it's like, okay, we know what hills we're willing to die on, and then everything else we can apply really flexibly. And the way Brad talks about this, and I would certainly co-sign on this, obviously, is it really breaks down into three areas, and that would be like a rugged and flexible mindset, rugged and flexible identity, and rugged and flexible action. So in the mindset space, it's like, well, what is your headspace? That makes you feel like when you're performing your best. Do you have a sense of when you're operating really well, like when you're brewing something and you're just like in the zone, in the flow state, whatever it is? What are the conditions that get you into that headspace? What are your sources of strength? And the more we can sort of attune ourselves to those things, the easier they become to replicate. Like if this is a super simple example, that you're a morning lark, you should lean in on doing your best work in the morning. If you're a night owl, well, you shouldn't be trying to do a bunch of stuff in the morning where you're sort of not in your best headspace. Again, that's a simplistic example, but being more self-aware around the conditions that prime you for success can be really helpful to try to replicate that, and sort of protect you from, the change that's always happening all around us. Now, rugged and flexible identity, similar to the mindset, is like, well, what are your core, this goes back to your core values. Like, how do you define your identity? Are you a brewer only? No, you're a parent, you're a spouse, you're a son or daughter, you're someone's friend, hopefully. There's all this stuff going on. So if you're fusing your identity to one thing at the expense of all others, that can be really dangerous, because if you're so locked in on one thing, should something bad happen to your business, for example, it all falls apart. It's much better to be diversified and having like, yes, you know what's really important. And while a business might seem like it's really important, what's actually really important are your kids. What's actually really important is your own health. And we can talk about this more, but making sure you're not doing something at the expense of everything else, that can be really helpful in sort of navigating life's challenges. The last one is rugged and flexible actions, and sort of like, well, how are you treating yourself? What are you doing every day, as we mentioned earlier, sort of in furtherance of your core values? Are you working on trivial things and then procrastinating on the important stuff? The more you can sort of develop your actions to align with the things that you consider important, the more rugged you can be around the real important stuff, and weather those storms and then be flexible about the stuff that just frankly isn't as important, the better you're going to be able to navigate all the changes happening all the time around us.
So in the brewing industry, owners often wear so many hats. They're the brewer, they're the accountant, they're the
Yeah.
janitor, and tap room and the hospitality side of things, they're interacting with tons of customers, back to back to back. It takes its toll. What additional recommendations do you have for people in the industry just to get in the headspace to be productive?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question, Andrew. And I think a way of thinking about it is the inverse. It's like, well, how are you recovering from these things? Understanding that you can't be on 24/7. So if you think about it, it's like, okay, super stressful, demanding, you gotta all these deliverables, you gotta do your accounting, gotta do all this stuff. What do you do when you're not doing that, right? Like, how do you recover from that? And a good way of thinking about it is this kind of notion of code switching. So when you transition from your work life to your home life, for example, can you leave your work life at work, and can you then transition into your home life? And while you're at work, can you leave your home life at home? So essentially, you can engage in sort of active recovery, like you're taking care of a sick loved one or a parent, or your kids are pissing you off, whatever it could be. You can't really do anything about that at work. So perseverating or ruminating about that isn't really helpful. But by not focusing on that at work, you can actually recover from that. So then when you come back to that space, you can then see it with fresh eyes. You haven't been thinking and sort of stewing about it all day. You can see it, and treat it with sort of the intention that it requires, rather than sort of half-assing everything because you're so overstressed and you're trying to do everything at the same time. So thinking about it that way can be helpful. But yeah, I mean, there's only so many hours. One thing I recommend in my coaching practice is really finding a way to have clear transitions, either from your home life to your work life, and then back from your work life to your home life. And somewhere in there, having some space for yourself, having some space to transition. So again, for me, it's a little hard because I work from home, and my only space is a door that I get to close every once in a
Yeah.
while. And so my kids don't barge in. Right. And so I have to be really intentional about how I wind down my day, because I don't have a commute. I don't have like a podcast I can listen to or anything like that. I just like wrap up my stuff and, go and inhabit the other area of my life. So what I try to do is just be really intentional about my wind down process, and same thing for my startup process at work. So I can sort of shed some of the responsibilities that might be weighing on me, knowing that I really can't do anything about them anyway between 9 and 5, or however, whatever my workday looks like that day. And then understand it's like, okay, I'm gonna come back to this later. And in the meantime, I'm gonna try to be super present about what's really important to me right now, and not procrastinate on the things that I need to do. So for example, if you have a to-do list, to-do lists can be great. They can also be terrible. I don't know if any of you, I've certainly had my moments where, I would do things that weren't on my to-do list, and then I would add them so I could check them off. It's like, so finding some discipline around making sure you're not majoring in the minors, and making sure that you're doing the hard thing. Like, let's say you need to lay off an employee and you're sort of procrastinating that because it's icky and you don't want to do it, you don't want to deal with it, but it's the right decision for the business. Like, well, how are we priming ourselves to making sure we're doing these things first, and not procrastinating, or not just like, you know bemoaning it and then letting it come back to bite us later. I'm sure there's a lot of people on this call that are watching or whatever, who been procrastinating on doing one thing or another, and then when they finally do it, it takes like 10 minutes, and they're like, oh my god, I've just been stressing myself out for 2 weeks of this thing that I could have just done really quickly if I would have just got into the headspace to do that. So a lot of the work is being as silly as it sounds, like really listening to your gut, becoming really sensitive as to what your emotions, what your feelings are telling you, so that then you can interpret that in such a way, again, run it through your core values and interpret that in such a way so you know how to proceed. And certainly doing the hard things first. If you have some resistance about something, if you're procrastinating something, if you're feeling guilty about something, this would be the same in therapy as in coaching. you know that's the thing to attack first. That's the thing to look at. If there's something that's sort of holding you back and you kind of know what it is, getting to the bottom of that. And the obstacle becomes the path is something that Marcus Aurelius mentions in Meditations. That is so true. It's like the obstacle that's in front of you, that is your path forward, and that's the thing that you need to attack head on, and not like busy yourself with all this other stuff like, oh, let me spend like do 10 revisions on the label for this beer or whatever. It's like, you know what, it's great. What you really need to do is sort out your distribution channel, or whatever it is, right? So focus. A good mantra that I have, and I recommend a lot of people, is don't major in the minors. Focus on the important stuff. And what you'll find is when you focus on the important stuff, you start feeling better about yourself. You're feeling accomplished. You're feeling productive. You're feeling like you're performing better. And a lot of the easier stuff will then just fall into place.
As we mentioned, brewery owners wear lots of different hats, and we always want to focus on the most important thing, but at the end of the day, we can't do 100 things on our checklist in a 24-hour period. We rely on our team to help us out. Do you have any suggestions or tips for better delegating and letting go of those things that aren't the most important to us, that someone else can just as equally handle successfully?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and I think it's anyone who cares deeply feels like they need to kind of hold on to everything, and just have their finger in every different thing that's happening in the business, and it can be really, and you can see how that can become overwhelming, can lead to burnout. You feel like you're the ultimate decider. So finding people that you can trust, and essentially being a little vulnerable, and sort of accepting the fact that you can't do it all. Like, yeah, maybe you aren't the marketing whiz that you thought you were, and you need to outsource this. Let people cook. I think what happens a lot of times is, you feel like you need to be the decider, you need to be a leader, where sometimes all you need to do is let people do their job. Like, that could be the best form of leadership. So it's really just becoming more self-aware around, okay, am I actually helping this process or hurting this process? Is me involving myself in this process actually productive for this, or are people just getting pissed off? Or, are my employees don't feel like they can give me difficult information, or don't feel like they can give me feedback because I'm gonna, not accept it. So really empowering people and creating a space where people can flourish, develop mastery. I mean, in many ways, employees all want the same thing. There's this theory called self-determination theory that says employees all want, they all want three things. They want some autonomy. They want to feel like they're developing a sense of mastery, and they want some sense of belonging. So if you can provide that to any employee, let them find a way. Are they feel like they're flourishing in their job? Do they feel like they have some control around their stuff? Do they feel like they're part of a team that's moving forward? You're going to have happy employees. I mean, that's just what the science says. There's a great book called Drive by Dave Pink that talks about this, that I'd recommend for folks. But yeah, so you don't need to overthink this stuff. When I started working with Brad and Steve, I was fully aware. I mean, I felt kind of like oh, I'm just getting played with all this positivity, like work stuff, but it works, right? Because it's like, once I started Zach, yep, I feel really loyal to them. They make me feel like a valued member of the team. I have a lot of autonomy to develop the business the way I think makes sense. And I feel like I'm part of it. I feel like I'm an actual part of the group. And these guys are published authors. I'm not. Public intellectuals. I'm not. Yet they create an environment that makes me feel like I am, an equal contributor, and they know what they're doing, right? And part of me is like, oh man, they're just kidding me with the self-determination theory stuff. But it's like, hey, I think I'm a great employee. I really enjoy the work that I'm doing. And a lot of that is because, Brad and Steve and myself, with the employees we have now, we've created this environment where, hey, all ideas are welcome. It's very egalitarian. There's no bad ideas, just bad responses to ideas.
No, I love that space you've just shared. And I believe it's in Brad's book, The Practice of Groundedness. He talks about a high level executive. She got her highest job she's ever had. And, she was used to being able to put herself in situations and help put out fires. But in that current role, that really wasn't what she was designed to do. So she had to step back, and instead of, getting the task done a little bit quicker, she had to just watch as it may have taken her employees a little bit longer, but ultimately it taught them and worked them towards that mastery that you just explained.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, every professional job has this type of distinction where at some point you're an operator and maybe you're doing the work, and then if you are there long enough, at some point you become management, and can't really be an operator anymore. Now it's your job to help other people become better operators. Is that something that you can that you're prepared for, that you're trained for? I mean, there's a lot of people out there who are terrible managers and would much rather be operators, but the way sort of businesses work is, if you want to get a raise, you want to get promoted, all that stuff, you have to take on more leadership responsibilities. So it's really finding the right fit that works well for you. And if you are in a different setting and money's nice and promotions are nice, then really being clear is, okay, I actually need to step back here. Like, I'm not helping my team by coming in the last minute and just kind of redoing everything and doing it my way. I mean, there's a great example from the band the Foo Fighters, where for, I think it was the
I
first
didn't expect
album.
this coming, but I'm really excited for what you have to say right now.
Yeah. So here, check this out. So Dave Grohl, who was obviously the drummer for Nirvana, started Foo Fighters, and the first album, he wasn't happy with the tracks, so he actually went in and re-recorded all of like the bass track, the drum track, everything else by himself, and it almost destroyed the band because the band was like, like, why are we even here if you're just going to do all the work? And he really regretted that. And since then, he hasn't done it again. But for him, like, he wanted it to be so perfect that he felt like, okay, well, I'm just going to make this thing like the best it can be. And like, almost irrespective of feelings or his friends that like, went in on this project with him. And he saw that as a teaching moment for himself, basically being like, you know what, I can't do that. Like, it needs, even if it's a little bit messier and isn't as perfect as I wanted it to sound, like the cost of losing my friends and having this band essentially disintegrate was more important.
No, I like that example from Dave Grohl. That's a good one. So kind of going back to core values is something you just talked about, like the balance, the presence, separating ourselves from work. I'm just like you. I have a door that takes me out into the world of my family and everything else. And it's challenging being a business owner, manager, or even just an employee. You're thinking about that company you work for because you hopefully really like what you're doing. So do you have any other additional tips for just disconnecting and separating? Because I know so many owners, managers I talk to, they feel like they're always on call. They just keep their phone on the
Yep.
weekend. They might not go out with friends and family because they're just anticipating that call from their staff saying, hey, I need you to help put out this fire. I need you to come do
Yep.
this or that. How can we better let go and trust others?
Well, you're just like setting them up, but I'll knock them down here. So the growth equation, which again, Brad, Steve, and I started, I think, almost 6 years ago now. Essentially, the growth equation itself, what that equation means is stress plus rest equals growth. And that's true for athletics, right? If you want to get bigger muscles, you want to become faster, whatever, it's true in every setting. It's one of these sort of like universal truths that Brad and Steve and their research and reporting for Peak Performance, which was the first book they did together, and the book that started this all for us, for you and me, Andrew. It's kind of this notion of like, yep, you got to stress the system. You got to get out of your comfort zone a little bit. Then you need to rest, to absorb that training, absorb those lessons or whatever, and only then can you have growth. And again, that's true for your body, that's true for your mind, that's true for your environment. It's something that's like, the Buddha was talking about this 2,000 years ago, or sorry, 3,000 years ago. The Stoics were talking about this 2,000 years ago. Existentialists were talking about this 100 years ago. These are almost like universal truths. So to think that somehow you can escape that cycle and that you don't need rest, or that you can just assume all the stress in the world, it's almost just being realistic. It's like, we're humans, we're fallible, we need a rest, we need to
We're going to
recover.
get
And
burnt out. It's going to impact your business.
seriously, and that's where this concept of sort of heroic individualism comes in, which is another concept that the Brad Stulberg and Steve Magnus write a lot about. And this sort of this game of one-upmanship, where it's like, against both yourself and others, of sort of thinking that you need to achieve all this stuff, and what ends up happening is sort of the goalpost is always like 10 yards down the field, where like, if I can only get this goal, then I've made it. You get there, doesn't feel that great, but it's this idea, is like, oh, I got to do this all myself. I got to like, lift myself up on my bootstraps, and I'm the only person responsible for all this. Really sets you up to a place where that's the type of thing that can really lead to burnout. That's the type of thing that, it's just not, it's not respective of what reality really is, which is it's messy. We need to do it in community. It's there's all these expressions of like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others type stuff. Um, and unfortunately, it's true, but it's also really hard when you feel like you're the one who cares most about one thing, or it's your business. No one's going to care about it as much as you. I would actually push back on a comment like that. Actually, I'm sure your employees want to stay employed, and they probably, if you give them the opportunity, they'll display as much ownership for this thing as you do, and care about it just as much as you do. If you're willing, if you allow them to have some input, if you allow them to care about this as much as you do yourself.
I mean, you nailed it. You have to allow them the ability to do it. You have to bring them as part of the team and give them the respect and trust to, I guess, make a difference. Impact the business.
Yeah,
And
yeah, and they can see some really great ideas that that we can just be blind to. Again, to assume that we have all the information is dangerous, and it's much better to come in with a sense of humility and a sense of vulnerability and be like, okay, do you think we should do this better? Why do you think that? And maybe, and if that answer is the right answer, then it's on you to kind of like, accept that, take your flowers and just be like, all right, this was a great idea. Let's do that. But it's really about kind of letting go and thinking that you don't need to be the ultimate decider, like you don't need to be the king of this whole thing. It's much better to be parliament.
And if we don't let go, it really leads into what's one of the traps, the trap of heroic individualism, where, that could be a negative for you personally or for your business. Now, what is this heroic individualism you speak of, Chris?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of this idea of one-upmanship with yourself and others, where it's like, oh, for me to succeed, someone else needs to fail. Like I can only do this alone. Like, I'm the hero of my own, I'm the only person who can chart my course the way I want to. And unfortunately, what that does, it's basically a fast track to burnout. And there's a lot of signs where you can see this, where you kind of have like, always feeling like you're in a hurry. This sound like low level anxiety. There's this quote uh, by Ralph Waldo Emerson that it's like, men basically lead lives of quiet desperation. I'm misquoting it, but this idea of just like, oh, like I need to figure this out. I got to make more money. I got to like, oh, my kid needs braces, like all this stuff. If you're trying to do all that alone, these are the things that are gonna be problematic. Some other signs are, recurring intuition that something isn't right, but you're just proceeding along anyway, like always feeling like you need to be on and then struggling to turn it off. Feeling way too busy, but also restless when you're trying to recover. Not really feeling easily distractible, unable to focus. These are all things, unable to sit sort of silently, sit quiet with your own thoughts. Obviously feeling lonely and empty inside can be these things because you're not part of a community, struggling to be content. Successful by conventional standards, but maybe you feel like that's never enough and there's nothing that you can do to make you feel like you've arrived. All these things can be really problematic, and better than heroic individualism is, again, going back to this concept of being rugged and flexible, where it's like, all right, know what hills you're willing to die on. And then the rest apply really loosely, be open to change, be open to new ideas. Yes. Like you want this business to be, so for example, in the brewery, I don't know too much about brewing, but I'm sure it's a craft, right? It's a process, and people do it really well and spend a lot of intention to try to do a good job and come up with new brews and different ingredients or whatever, right? Like that can be really important, right? And you want to make sure that you put all your energy, all your intention into doing that well. Some of this other stuff, like what the label looks like, should you spend as much time on the label as you spend on the actual beer that you're making? I mean, I don't know. Maybe, again, I don't know how it works. I'm sure some people choose the beer based on the label alone. That's certainly how I've chosen wine in the past. But, what's really important. So by being able to key in on what really matters to you, what's really are your sources of meaning, the sort of the craft of it, sort of separating sort of pseudo productivity of just like busy work, like doing all this stuff. Oh, I'm so stressed out. I got 100 emails to answer right now, versus real productivity, which is just like, I've created something really amazing that I can't wait to share with the world. And I'm going to let my team, whose job it is to share with the world, do their job. So it's really about trying to find a balance where you can be productive, you can feel like your life has meaning, you have some purpose, and then some of this other stuff you're willing to just be, a little bit less attached.
So in the beer industry right now, Chris, we have nearly 10,000 breweries. That is a lot of breweries operating across the United States. Some markets have more than others, but often you go to the end of the street, you have a brewery there and you have a brewery there. And it's hard to not look at the competition sometimes. And beer is an industry that's
Yep.
very collaborative. But at the end of the day, when you're a business owner, you want to guest first choice to be your beer, not down the street. So, what advice do you have for brewery owners, managers, and staff to not get stuck in the trap of just constantly looking at their competition to see what they're doing, but really focusing on, what differentiate themselves and leaning really hard into it?
Sure, sure. Yeah. So I would say a couple things. One, I would say it's important to know what your competitors are doing, right? Like it's important to just like not stick your head in the sand and not know what's happening. So it's important to know what's going on. But with that, you need to calibrate it with kind of like what's within your control and what's not. And this goes back to tragic optimism, where, you know, if we are thinking about, okay, this other brewery just opened up and they have like, lines out the door, and like whatever example you want, it's like, oh man, they're crushing it. It's like, oh, like this sucks or whatever. It's like, well, what can you do? What's within your control? You can't control anything that they do. Can you make a better product? Like sort of keying in on the things that you have some influence over, it's always going to be better than perseverating or ruminating about things that you absolutely have no control over. So in many ways, thinking about, and this is particularly important in today's world, right? Because, there is truly a lot to be upset, frustrated, and saddened by, but as Brad writes in his book, Master of Change, if we have any chance of, and I'm gonna quote this directly, we have any chance of fixing a broken world, we can't be broken people. Life is hard and wonderful all at once, and our work is to do the best we can to embrace all of it. So, maybe you can have some humility. It's like, oh, this brewery is really crushing it. You can have some gratitude for all the work that they're doing. Maybe that trickles down to your industry or to your brew house, right? And thinking about things is just like, if you can get out of the doom and gloom of right this second and sort of shift your perspective, open your aperture, engage in some future thinking. Like, how would future you 10 years from now look back at what's happening right now? What advice would you give? What advice would future you give you right now? And you can do that now for things that happened in the past. It's like maturity. We all think we're super mature, right? In high school, we thought we were super mature. We get to college, we realize what idiots we were in high school. You graduate college, you get a job, you realize, oh, I'm super mature now. And you realize what an idiot you were in college. It's this constant process of being able to look back and be like, hey, there's things I could have done to improve. And that can sort of free you up, again, if you engage in some future thinking and open your aperture to really think about it in terms of like, okay, I'm in the midst of some change. There's some things afoot here. Well, what are my sources of strength? What's actually within my control? Can I keep making the best product, or do I need to do something else? And I, folks might be watching and listening, being like, "Well, it's not as simple as that." It's like, obviously, this is a really complex thing, but at a very basic level, like this is true both in your three marriages, in your work life, in yourself, and in your sort of relational life with your spouse, friends, whatever.
So, like, what's the importance in all of this? Because whether you're running a brewery all by yourself or you have a large team, how important is having that support group of core people you can open up with, have conversations with, and just be yourself around?
It's super important. It's super important. In fact, one way of thinking about this, like what really supports excellence, what supports high levels of performance, are really what I would call, sort of foundational values. These are values that are also, you've seen them in a lot of places. They're expressed. Brad talks about them in the practice of gratitude. Steve Magnus talks about it in Two Hard Things. There's all these things that are sort of the precursors for performance. So one is sleep, right? If you're not sleeping reasonable amount, it's different for everyone, but let's say like at least 7 hours. If you're sleeping 4 hours a night and you think you're going to crush it at work and life, sorry, buddy, it's just not possible. If you're not getting enough sleep, if you're not recovering and resting your body, your ability to perform at a high level is going to be extremely difficult. Maybe you can do it for a little bit. Maybe you can even do it for years. At some point, you're going to have to pay the piper, and it's gonna be bad. In fact, in medicine, this has been a huge problem where, doctors have to work these super long hours, and it's shown to reduce performance, but, the system is so entrenched, it makes it really difficult to sort of change out of that. Um, so sleep is one. Are you eating like crap? Are you nourishing your body or eating like shit? Are you drinking too? No offense to beer makers, are you drinking to excess too
It's
much?
something a
Because that
lot of us
affects
are
your
really
sleep.
thinking about, our drinking habits these days.
I mean, that affects your sleep, right? All these. So another way of thinking about it, it's a complex system, right? So there's so many things we need to do well, and the best thing we can do is set ourselves up for success. So, do you have any vices? Are you smoking and drinking too much? If you're smoking, you cut it out. Do you have a movement practice? Are you moving your body? We're humans. We've been designed evolutionarily to move. It's only in the last couple hundred years where we've been sitting all the time, right? This isn't our nature. This isn't part of our evolution, and we're seeing the effects of that with obesity, diabetes, all the bad, right? Um, the last one is like, do you have community? Do you have people in your life? Are you actually interacting with humans, not just on social media, not just rage tweeting or whatever, but do you have a spiritual practice? You go to church, if that's your thing. Do you are part of a run club? Is that your thing? Do you like just have friends that you can meet up with, people you can lean on, people that are sources of strength? All these things are so fundamental and really foundational for you to be able to perform your best that to not pay attention to those first. In fact, in my coaching practice, that's the first thing we sort out. Like if you're some high powered executive and you're telling me you're sleeping 4 hours a night, guess what? We're spending the next 2 months trying to recalibrate these sleeping habits, because you claim you want to achieve all these things. You claim you want to perform at this level, but you're essentially, you're shooting yourself in the foot literally by not taking care of this foundational stuff. So the foundational stuff is just really important. And I would say for anyone listening or watching, that's a great place to start. You know, Self-awareness is the door that opens all possibilities. But once you're self-aware and you want to improve yourself, it's really about, well, what's the most low-hanging fruit? And unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff out there these days where it's like, oh, optimize this, get up and make your bed at 5 in the morning, cold plunge, worry about your VO2 max. All that stuff is great. That's not the 80%. Like 80% is like, are you sleeping? Are you interacting with people? Are you eating well? Are you not engaging in any vices that are destructive? Um, you know, and it's not sexy and it's not easy. But that's sort of the ticket, unfortunately.
So first, Chris, I never want to be the cold plunge person. Maybe future me 10 years from now will be hugely into that, but that's one thing I never want to do. But looking at the beer industry, let's say a tap room, for example, you have all your staff, you want them to do a billion things. You can't say, here's a list of 10 things you need to change right now. You really have to narrow the focus down to a couple things. So looking at the beer industry as a whole and just our conversation today, we've talked on lots of different topics that people can apply to their lives to see more success in the 3 areas that you focus. But bringing it back together, like, how do you choose what to make your focus right now? Because I want people to
Yeah.
leave an action item, not just, okay, well, what Chris said was really interesting, it makes sense, but how can we actually apply this to our lives in a way that's not overwhelming?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Andrew. And I would say it's like we actually already know what that answer is. It's lingering in our gut. Like we already kind of know what the right thing to do is. We already know what's the difficult decision we need to make, and it's really our resistance to essentially moving ahead with that becomes the big impediment for performance. And some of it could be like you kind of know it's like I can't be the accountant, the janitor, the brewmaster, and the meet and greet, the host, the meet and greet person. It's just not possible. This deep down, it. So it's about really becoming more sensitive, sort of affect labeling, really, really digging down and being really honest and transparent with yourself as to, okay, what are my strengths? What aren't my strengths? And then proceeding again, as we talked earlier, which like, okay, well, what do I have control over, and what do I not have control over? And insofar as I do have control of things, like what can I do to be really present and mindful, applied to the things that are within my control, and the stuff that aren't, maybe I can have some minor influence over them. But for the most part, those things are going to happen regardless. Those things are again, to think that, who do we think we are that we can control every single factor, right? So it's almost just like being more realistic about it, but also being really honest and vulnerable with yourself as to, okay, I can really lean in onto this area, but to think I'm going to lean into all of them and do that in perpetuity, I mean, it's just not realistic.
And how is someone going to feel when they apply these practices to their life?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned in the beginning, if you feel like you're living in accordance with a code, with your core values, that you're being the best version of yourself with the people that you love, with yourself, engaging, having a lot, giving yourself a lot of grace, a lot of self love with your work, again, the natural byproduct of all this stuff is happiness. And, it sounds kind of silly and kind of woo woo, but, you can't force happiness. You can't force satisfaction. You can't just be like, I'm going to be happy today. It's like the same thing with depressed people is like, why don't you just cheer up? It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. The only way that depressed people can cheer up is medication sometimes and cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Because you're trying to get out of this rut. Similarly, for folks who aren't clinically depressed and you're just trying to perform at your best, it's so important to just have like a really good sense of what's important, what matters to you, and what will naturally come. The natural byproduct of that is going to be happiness. It's going to be satisfaction. It's going to be meaning. It's going to feel contentment because you're doing the best you can with everything that's available to you in that moment.
I love it. Now, Chris, you've referenced quite a few books today. You've referenced Man's Search for Meaning. Give us a couple of the other books you talked about today that you recommend people dive into following this conversation.
Yeah, so I would say definitely Man's Search for Meaning. That book is kind of broken up into two parts. So if, you can just read the first half, and that'll be enough for most folks. The Practice of Groundedness by Brad Stulberg, which I mentioned a couple times. His other book, Master of Change, might be actually really helpful for people that are feeling like really sort of caught up in sort of the machinations of what's happening in the beer industry right now. That book really talks about, how to navigate change, and it sort of lets us, just lays it bare that change is all around us. We can either be Pollyannish and try to get to the past, or realize that we're always going to end up someplace new. So I would say those three books would be really helpful. The other one I mentioned was Drive by Dave Pink, which it's more of like a work productivity book, but he really articulates, as I mentioned earlier, sort of self-determination theory in just like a really accessible way. And he's kind of like a funny writer as well, so he's great.
So real quick, how many hours a week are you reading or listening to audiobooks, Chris?
Oh man. So a big part of my job is reading. As a performance coach, I'm engaged in self-study all the time. So if I recommend a book to a client, I'm usually rereading it so I can be up on it. Or if I hear about new books, I'm always kind of on top of, the new sort of self-help books. I read a lot of psychology, a lot of philosophy, and a lot of business books, just so I can, again, better service my coaching clients, but also in my own mindfulness journey. I'm always trying to find ways to do more. So yeah, I probably read maybe 20 hours a week, 25 hours a week.
Oh my gosh, I thought I
A
listened to a
lot.
lot once in a week. You're impressive.
It's a lot.
I wish I had that.
But it isn't all for work. It isn't all for work. I mix it up a little bit. So I'm usually reading one classic book that I felt like I should have read a long time ago, and then some of the work stuff. And just always kind of following my curiosity. I think if anyone's trying to develop a reading habit, just read stuff that you like. And if there's a book that you're 100 pages in and it's a dog and you're not liking it, stop. There's too many books to read. No one's going to admonish you for, giving up on a book you're not enjoying.
For me, I had to even put reading on my calendar so I would make myself do it till it became a habit. I put porch book on my Google Calendar because I wanted to make myself read a book outside, and I do it most of the year.
I love it. Yeah. Hey, whatever you need to do to prime yourself to do things that are important to you. I think, in many ways, Andrew, we didn't talk about your core values, but hey, if one of your core values is to be well read, to be well informed, well, look at what you've decided to do to live in furtherance of that value. You put it on your calendar. You try to be really intentional about what you do. And, I think that's a great example for anything that people are trying to do. It's like, hey, this is important to you. What signal are you putting out into the world to actually manifest that? And not in like some woo-woo way, like, oh, like good things happen to me, but actually being applied. How are you taking your self-awareness, your mindfulness, and be really tactical in how you deploy it? And knowing you can't just deploy it all the time, like some screenshot. Like, it needs to be very directed and very, very specific to what you're trying to achieve. And again, if it's being a better husband to your wife, for example, what can you do? What can you do every day? When you talk to your spouse, one thing that I do when she's trying to tell me something, I'm obviously trying to listen. I make sure my body is literally turned and facing her. It's a small signal. She doesn't notice it. I mean, maybe she does. I don't know. Maybe she'll probably watch this and be like, oh, I figured out all your tricks or whatever. But that primes me for being really present and actually listening to her. And certainly, people are like, yeah, I listen to my wife. I'm like, do you actually listen to her? Like, are you actually listening to the important people in your life? And is that something that I take pride in being present when my spouse, my parents, my siblings, my friends are telling me something, and so another example is like anyone who says, "Oh, I'm terrible with names." That's a factor of habit. There isn't anything innately wrong with you that you can't remember names. You can remember all kinds of stuff. It's a choice. It's being really directed about. It's like, I mean, if you care about remembering people's names, there's tons of memory books you can read. There's tons of little tricks you can do to prime yourself to remember people's names. It's just deciding whether that's something that's important to you.
Oh, that's great. No, I'm going to go back and listen to this conversation because it's so many little tidbits. And right now, it's kind of your final thought. I want to work on being present and just turning my body in the direction of the person I'm talking with a little bit better.
Hey, try it out. See what works for you.
So, Chris, anyone interested in get a hold of you, how can they do so or learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, so I'd recommend people check out the Growth Equation. We have a weekly newsletter where, high performers from all over the world read, athletes, professional athletes, executives, to just get, really good, again, not really clickbaity stuff. Like we're not trying to optimize the 1%. We're trying to make sure that like the 80% is taken care of and give people really, really good information. We also have a podcast called Farewell, that's on the Growth Equation. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. And then I have my own personal coaching practice, which you can access through the Growth Equation as well.
And lastly, if people remember one thing from today, what do you hope that is?
Yeah, I hope that people remember that, again, the Viktor Frankl quote from the beginning, people can take anything from you except the last of human freedoms. And that's your ability to decide how you respond to anything that comes to you. It's your choice. So, oh, this person is pissing me off. You can decide to be pissed off. It's you're deciding to let that person piss you off. You're deciding to let these things that are extraneous to your core mission affect you. So insofar as you can be really mindful and just create a little bit of space, find some equanimity, find some space between the stimulus and response to really figure out what's important. How do I want to proceed? What lives, what is in furtherance of my core values and the things that are important to me? Am I honoring my family by the decision I'm making now or not? Am I doing right by my employees by the decision I'm making now or not? Am I going to be able to live myself, look in the mirror by the decision I'm making or not? That's within your control. And to think that it's not, it's a shame because you're leaving a lot on the table.
Awesome, Chris. I've enjoyed this conversation so much. Everybody tuning in or watching in the future, I hope you have as well. Chris, thanks again. And I hope to share, a beverage with you at some point in the future, face to face.
Sure, definitely.
Cheers.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.